Let me start by saying I've had a wonderful, wonderful time in Ithaca. You all are really blessed to live in a community like this. I want to start by saying that. And sometimes, you know, when you're in a place, you don't really recognize maybe all of the strengths of it. And so from coming from the outside and seeing it, it's just been mind-blowing for me. So I've had a great 3 days. Everybody I've met has been just wonderful. I'm just really impressed with the level of vibrancy of the food system here and the efforts, the long-term efforts to make sure that people have access to healthy food. So you are really blessed to be here. So I want to say that, and I'm blessed to have been here in your presence for the last few days. Secondly, I always give praise and honor to the Creator. And I'm not really a religious person, but although I respect everyone's religion, but I do believe that there's a force or an energy, however you want to conceptualize that, that creates order in the universe, that things are not happening in a random fashion. And so I always acknowledge that and attempt to attune my life to that force and to live in tune with those energies. Thirdly, I always give honor to my ancestors also, because it's on their shoulders upon which I stand. And in fact, the reality is that each of us are our ancestors. So the DNA that flowed through my ancestors' blood continues to flow through mine. And I'm absolutely convinced that many of the things we do are not of our own volition, but are because of ancestral compulsion. And so as I stand here before you, I'm really representing not just myself, but I'm representing all of those who came before me. Also, many of you saw the film Urban Roots, and there's been maybe 10, 12 other film crews who have come out to Detroit in the last year or 2 years and film what we're doing. And that's kind of an interesting phenomenon, because once somebody appears in a film, then people see them in public and they start pointing and say, oh, there he is, it's him. And it's just kind of, it's still freaking me out, to tell you the truth, right? Is that a term from the 60s? It's still kind of freaking me out, you know, because one, we never set out for notoriety in doing this work. This is not the purpose of it. We're trying to make improvements in our community, and because some people like the work that we're doing, they've exposed it to the larger national community and to the global community. So on one level, we're very thankful for that, but on another level, this whole kind of celebrity thing that happens in America is a little weird. So I want to let you know that not only am I standing here as a representative of the ancestors in my family, but I'm also standing here as a representative of many people in Detroit who do this work. This is not my work. I'm part of a collective of people who do this work, and it just so happens that at this time I'm one of the spokespersons for the work. But I'm really representing dozens and dozens of people in the city of Detroit who are doing this work, and perhaps their faces haven't appeared on films, but they're equally as important, if not more important, than I am. So I just really want to acknowledge that none of this happens individually. Even the transformation that we have to go through doesn't happen individually. It's a collective venture, and for some reason in American society, they're always looking for someone to single out and to put up on some pedestal. So I just want to let you know I am resisting that. So I'm a representative of a number of people in Detroit doing this work. A number of people were at the talk on Saturday, so I'm going to try not to say the same things I said on Saturday, but I don't really remember everything I said Saturday, because usually I'm not operating from a script, so I have no notes in front of me, so I'm really talking to you from my life experience. I'll start maybe by just giving a little background on the work we're doing in Detroit generally, and then talking specifically about the anti-racism work that we're doing in Detroit. And in fact, maybe I'll start first by telling you a little about myself. I'm a child of the 1960s and 1970s, as I'm sure many of you are. Some of you with gray hair look like you're ex-hippies, I'm sure. Like that dude right there, he looks And so, you know, I kind of come out of that same era too. I'm 55, almost 56 years old. So although I was young in the 60s, toward the later part of the 60s, I was old enough to kind of be conscious of some of the social dynamics. And Detroit, in many ways, was a hotbed of black rebellion, both prior to the awful a rebellion that occurred in 1967, and I say awful in the sense that about 43 people were killed, and also after that time period. So a number of organizations have had their genesis in Detroit that are significant within the black movement. And so I am firmly rooted within the tradition of black struggle that has taken place in this country, and my consciousness was molded in Detroit in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and so that continues to shape in many ways how I look at the world. I'm not stuck in the 60s, you know, but I think there's some valuable lessons that we learned in the 60s that have to be brought forward into this time period. There's some other dumb stuff, too, that happened that we need to, you know, toss out the window somewhere. But there's a lot of value in kind of the mass activism and the social unrest and the questioning of society that took place in the 1960s and 70s. And although I was very young, much of that stuck with me, and throughout my adult life has continued to define who I am. So let's talk about Detroit just a little. And these are some demographics I gave Saturday. I'll just repeat these. Detroit in 1950 had 2 million people. And as of the latest census data that came out this year, we have 713,000. So that means that we have less than half the population that we had 60 years ago. And so that's presented a tremendous problem for the city of Detroit. And let me back up and say this, that one of the reasons for that depopulating of Detroit is racism, just straight up. Particularly after the 1967 rebellion, when lots of white people feared for their lives, they fled. But even prior to that, there was a great deal of white flight in Detroit, as there was in other national cities, as black people began to move into new neighborhoods. It's like the farther we move, the farther white people would move away from us. So, for example, the neighborhood that I live in, and I live in a house that I've lived in for 50 years, which is like really unusual. So I've been like very rooted and grounded in the same place. So I've had a chance to see that neighborhood evolve. So when I moved there at the age of 4, there were little white kids on the block that we played together. You know, I went in their backyard. I don't ever remember going in their houses, but we went in the backyard and we played. But after about a year, all those little white kids were gone. And so what happened in my neighborhood is pretty much what happened throughout the city of Detroit. So then white folks would move out farther, and then black folks we run behind them, we move farther, then they run farther. And so that pattern continues. So now you have lots of black folks in the suburbs of Detroit also, and now we have white people coming back into the city. So there's an interesting phenomenon going on. But so 1950, we had 2 million people. Now we have 713,000 people. Happening simultaneously with this depopulation of Detroit, there was a movement to empower Detroit's African-American population. And in 1972, we elected the first black mayor in Detroit, Coleman Young. And there was immediate antagonism from the suburbs towards Coleman Young. And he wasn't the type to back down either. And so there was not a very harmonious relationship for a number of years. In fact, there still isn't, frankly, between mostly black Detroit and the mostly white ring of suburbs surrounding Detroit. So many of the businesses left, and with them took the tax base. And so now the black leadership that had ascended to power was left to manage a city with less than half the tax base that it had in 1950, but still having to figure out how to mow the same number of lawns in parks, how to plow the same number of streets when it snows, how to keep the same number of streetlights lit. And so that's a tremendous challenge. And again, that is definitely related to the racial dynamic in Detroit. In fact, Detroit is one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the country. Many people don't know that, but Detroit, in fact, really, it's possible in Detroit, sometimes I can go for like weeks without seeing a white person. I mean, seriously. You know, and, you know, recently I'm starting to see a few in different neighborhoods, but I mean, Detroit is really, really, really segregated. So almost the entire city is black, and almost, you know, most of the suburbs are white. So again, that's just some context for the remarks. Now, we're talking about the food system specifically today. So one of the perhaps opportunities that we have is this tremendous amount of land as a result of the abandonment of much of the city. I mentioned also Saturday there are 103,000 vacant lots in the city of Detroit, which equate to about 6,000 acres. And so there are vast swaths of land in the city of Detroit which are unoccupied. There are blocks where there are no houses on the block. There are blocks where there's one house or two houses. There are blocks where there's 7, 8, 9 vacant lots in between the houses. There's lots and lots and lots of vacant land in the city of Detroit. So that is one of the factors that has led to Detroit having one of the most well-developed urban agricultural movements in the United States, that we simply have more access to land than most people in cities do. I started to say most people, and I looked over there at the folks from Eco Village, and I said, well, most people in a city at least. So that has helped to spur this urban agriculture movement in Detroit, which has gotten a lot of publicity throughout the country and throughout the world. And one of the reasons people are so interested is because, of course, Detroit has been in this downward spiral for a number of years. And so people are very interested in what the people of Detroit are going to do to kind of reimagine or rethink what Detroit can become. I mean, clearly the auto industry is not coming back in the sense that it used to exist. That's not going to happen. And so now we need to think about, well, what are our resources and what are our strengths and what talents do people have that we can translate into transforming our community. And one of the most promising things has been the urban agricultural movement. And so there are hundreds of gardens throughout the city of Detroit. I mentioned Saturday there's 1,600 that are officially registered with the Garden Resource Program, and there's many others that are underground, that are, guerrilla gardeners. And I pointed at him the other day, said he looked like a guerrilla gardener. I'll pick on him again. He kind of looks like the type that would just, gangsta up some land and do what he does. So we have lots of people in Detroit doing that too who are off the radar. Part of the reason, in addition to the tremendous amount of vacant land, people are now interested because they're really seeing it as a way to save money. As people are really strapped for cash, people are looking at ways that they can save money. And then some people are looking at it as an economic engine for the city of Detroit. They're looking at it as a possibility for really creating jobs and creating economic vibrancy within the city of Detroit. So all of those things are kind of converging right now. Now, in the midst of that, prior to 2006, when myself and several other people founded the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, almost all the major players in the urban agriculture movement in Detroit were people who would identify as white. All of the leadership in the organizations, the people who had the resources, who made available the tools, who made available seeds, who conducted workshops, were almost all white. And the thing is, I mean, they had very good intentions. They're not bad people. They're good people who are caught in a bad paradigm. And so we had this interesting thing that occurred in 2006. Myself, who comes out of frankly, what we call the Black Liberation Movement, right? Y'all heard of that before, right? Yeah. I'm familiar with the civil rights movement and all that, but, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and, Stokely Carmichael, they kind of resonated with me a little more than Dr. King. Although as I get older and reread Dr. King, I do have a great appreciation for his ideas also. He was no coward. He was kind of characterized during that time as, being passive and a coward. Not at all. So, in fact, really, there's been a snapshot of Dr. King that's been captured. So I don't mean a physical snapshot, but kind of a moment in time. There's not one Dr. King. We all evolve over time. And so Dr. King evolved over his period of involvement. But, what we know about Dr. King is I have a dream and I've been to the mountaintop, right? So they kind of just freeze frame those images, and that's what we know. But, if you read his Riverside address, why I opposed the war in Vietnam, Dr. King was also very radical. And so as I've grown older, I've developed a greater appreciation for Dr. King. But at that time, it was more the more militant kind of black power advocates that resonated much more with me. And so in 2006, so we had the convergence of myself and kind of, the folks I work with who are similarly inclined, moving into this urban agricultural movement. And so some interesting things occurred. Several white people said, why do they have to call it the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network? Why can't we just all work together and have a food security network? And so they started paying attention to us as we were speaking. And as they listened, they said, maybe there's something to this. And they started thinking more deeply themselves about race and about the work they were doing and how they could be more intentional in their work. And so the group I'm head of and the other kind of major farm in the city, which is called Earthworks Urban Farm, which is affiliated with the Capuchin Soup Kitchen, and which of course is a predominantly white organization that's several hundred years old, started having discussions. And we were having discussions on how we could cooperate. And we realized right off the bat that racism was a problem that was impeding the cooperation. And so we started discussing the possibility of holding what we called at that time dismantling racism trainings in the city of Detroit. I had undergone training with a group called DR Works. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. DR stands for Dismantling Racism. In Vancouver in 2006 at a conference as part of the Community Food Security Coalition. And so it's very enlightening for me for a number of reasons. One, they usually have a trainer who's a person of color and a trainer who identifies as white. And so the white woman who was there was an older white woman, maybe in her 60s, and very stately looking white woman who looked like she might be a member of the Ithaca Women's Society or something like that. I can imagine her with white gloves and a hat and all that. But then she started talking and she sounded like these black militants that I knew, right? So it was like, she was saying the same thing. And what I realized is that many times when I would speak to white people, they would automatically put up a wall, but they could hear what she was saying. And so that was enlightening for me. The other thing that was enlightening is that there were Asians and Latinos in the same training that I went through. And listening to Asians talk about, some of the Asians there talk about how their friends were getting operations to straighten their eyes. And listening to Latinos talking about how their friends were dyeing their hair blonde. And so I realized, having grown up in a almost all black community, that this phenomenon that we call white supremacy was not just affecting black people, but it affects other people of color also. So kind of having that firsthand experience with that dialogue was very enlightening for me. So we started discussing, again, going back to Detroit, about this idea of having dismantling racism training. And we kicked it around for a while. And finally, in the fall of 2009, one of our board members, Dr. Monica White, who's an adjunct professor of sociology at Wayne State University, and Lisa Richter, who was the outreach coordinator for Earthworks Urban Farm, sponsored a workshop at the Great Lakes Detroit Bioneers Conference. I don't know if you have Bioneers conferences here or not. You have one in Ithaca? Okay, great. And so the workshop was entitled Race, Food, and Resistance. And we had a standing room only crowd that came out to discuss the dynamics of race and how it impacts the food system. People were really hyped after this discussion and decided they wanted to continue the discussions. And so we met the next month at a local community center, and we have met monthly since that time. So initially, really, the group was about evenly divided between those who identify as black and those who identify as white. In time, it's become more white people for whatever reason, but initially it was almost evenly divided with a few Asians and a couple of Latinos. So those discussions were very enlightening. And we had very open, honest dialogue about race in a way that we weren't into blaming and shaming, and so that people felt comfortable. And let me say that it took me a while to learn how to talk to white groups, right? I mean, seriously, because I'm telling you the background I came from. And so, excuse me, I was used to talking to black audiences. And so sometimes when I would talk to a white audience, it's like I could just see people just shut down and then people be afraid. And so I had to learn how to talk to white audiences so that people hear what I'm saying, you know. But so we had these kind of really straight discussions about race and how it works within the food system and what white supremacy is and what white privilege is. And we continued these monthly meetings. Then after a few months, we discussed doing a more intense training. And so in the spring of last year, we contracted with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to come in and do a 2-day intensive training. So they came in from New Orleans, and Ron Chisholm and David Billings did an excellent 2-day training with us. And people were crying during the training because there were people that just, you know, this was like a revelation to them. They really unpacked a lot of things about race. So one of the things they did that was valuable is they talked about this idea of race, this social construct that we call race. And I say this idea because we know that scientifically race doesn't really exist, right? We have much more in common than we have different. And so it might be more accurate to talk about different cultural groups, but race as a scientific or biological phenomenon doesn't exist. So they talked about how this ideal, this social construct of race was created, and specifically how it manifested in the early United States and how it evolved. You know, race is not a static concept either. The idea of whiteness, you know, everybody who's white now wasn't white at first, right? Some people became white, right? So, and again, there's all kind of literature out about this now. But, you know, the Irish, for example, weren't allowed into the club at first. And so, and Jews were not allowed into the club at first. So, and other ethnic groups, Italians, I don't think they weren't cool either, you know, so. So these groups became white in time. So again, it's not a static concept, you know, it has changed over time. But so what happened is that these groups kind of, in exchange for buying into the concept of whiteness, were allowed a certain a degree of privilege. And so those who couldn't assimilate into this idea of whiteness were still kind of left out of the club and were left out of having this privilege. And so clearly somebody that looks like me, I can't play it off. I can't like, you know, even if I change my name, you know, it's just not gonna work. So, so anyway, the trainers from the People's Institute kind of helped us to unpack this idea of how the concept of whiteness evolved. And then they asked us a question, which was a very important question. They said, why are people poor? And they had us just ponder that. Then we wrote all these answers on chart paper, and, you know, some people said, well, they're lazy. Some black people said this too, by the way, okay? They're lazy, or they're this and that, they didn't do this, or, you know, and so they got us to begin to think about the systemic causes of poverty, that poverty exists not just because people don't take enough initiative or because they're lazy, but there are systemic causes that create poverty and that maintain poverty. In fact, the reality is in a capitalist society, and let me say this, I'm an anti-capitalist, okay? I'm not a communist, and in fact, you know, at one point I probably would have said I'm a socialist, but I'm kind of rethinking a lot of the boxes. So, you know, I think that we're going to have to create something probably that has never existed before. Frankly, I don't know what that's going to look like, frankly. And it's I guess something like what you all are doing at Eco Village. You don't know what it's, you know, the process is what's important. So you figure it out. So I don't know, you know, so I'm not in any dogma at all. But I know the capitalism, this unbridled greed that we see now is not working. I know that. So, but in a capitalist system, you have what economists call an acceptable level of unemployment, right? That is that you don't want everybody to be employed. And, you know, so you have a certain segment of the society that it's all right if they're unemployed. And so it kind of has to work like that, because it's kind of like if I have a bushel of apples and I say, well, here's one for you, and 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 here's 30 for me, right? Then, you know, we can't have equity. And so that's kind of how capitalism works, because there's no equitable distribution of the resources. We have this, what we're now calling the 1%. They have most of the wealth, and then the 99% are deprived. So they talked about how race is used. It's one of the factors that's used to decide who gets the 1 apple and who gets the 30 apples and who gets no apples. It's not the only factor. Class is a reality in American society, as well as gender discrimination. Those are all realities in the society that help to determine kind of who's in the club and who's not in the club, or who gets the lion's or the lioness's share of the pie and who gets the crumbs. And so it caused us to look at race a little more critically. And the thing that was really eye-opening for a lot of people who identify themselves as white is that they talked about the fact that no matter how good your intentions are, that white supremacy is a system that kind of moves forward, and unless you become an anti-racist and you consciously work against it, then you are capitulating with it. Yes. Somebody described it as like one of those moving walkways at the airport, right? You stand on it, and it just, you don't have to do anything. You stand there and it just moves you along. So that's kind of how white supremacy is. So unless first you become conscious of it, and then 2, you dedicate yourself to both personal transformation and to being actively involved with others to dismantle it, then you're part of the problem also. And so that was really eye-opening for a lot of the white people in the audience and who were participants. It wasn't an audience thing. We were participating in this training. And so many of them after that went back to their organizations and began to really look at the work they were doing. And they realized that what they were doing for the most part was kind of functioning from the charity model, that we're going to go in and help the less fortunate. And, there's nothing wrong with charity in the sense of wanting to help people. But the question is, how do we get to the systemic causes of this? And in our charity, how do we avoid becoming a permanent overclass that continues to give to those who are less fortunate? How do we revise that approach so that we're going into communities to empower communities as opposed to giving people a handout? So many of the people doing this work in Detroit now, as a result of this training, are thinking much more critically about their work, about how they enter communities, and about how they work with the people in those communities. Now, one example I want to give you of a group that has undergone tremendous transformation is the group that I mentioned at first, Earthworks Urban Farm. And the farm manager of Earthworks Urban Farm, Patrick Crouch, and I have become close friends. He's a white guy with red hair, and he's got a big, thick red beard. And he said when people first started telling him about me, they said, oh, he won't like you. And so, they kind of put up this divide. But we've become very good friends for a number of reasons, because of our interest in farming and also because of our interest in social justice. So under his leadership and other folks who have undergone this Undoing Racism training, they have started doing things like they have a training program called the EAT training program, Earthworks Apprenticeship Training. And they're training people in urban farming. And so one of the things that they've done is they have facilitated the creation of a business by people in the community who formerly were called their clients, so that these people now have created a business where they have a mobile produce truck and they're able to employ themselves selling produce in the city of Detroit. Another example coming from Earthworks Farm is one of their, what would formerly have been called a client, has now created a business where he's going to be using one of the hoop houses at Earthworks Farm to germinate seeds and start seedlings and sell those seedlings to people throughout the city. So I'm giving you an example of how an organization has transformed from the charity model and from coming in with a paternalistic missionary attitude to coming in with an attitude that seeks to empower people in the community that they're in. Several years ago, somebody from University of Michigan's newspaper interviewed me, and I said to them that I thought that white people working in the black community doing this type of work should be trying to work themselves out of a job. And so some people said I was racist for saying that, but frankly, I still believe that. That if you're coming into a community trying to solve a problem, see, keep in mind, this is what happens with the nonprofit industrial complex, or whatever folks are calling it now. People get a grant, right? How many people in here have ever gotten a grant? Throw your hands up. Okay, almost everybody. She gets lots of grants, I can tell. So you get a grant, and then, so you got to hire some staff people. So you think about, well, I know Billy over here. Billy's been doing good work. So you hire the people that you know, typically. And so, so if you're a white person and you know mostly white people, then you end up hiring mostly white people. And then in Detroit, which is a mostly black community, you come in with this mostly white group and try to do the work that you're doing. And so when the grant starts to run out, then the people who are on the payroll, they start trying to figure out, well, how am I going to sustain myself? So then you have another friend who's got another nonprofit who got a grant also. So some of the people who are working for you for this nonprofit, then they shift over here and they get another job over here. And so I watch these white people passing these jobs back and forth and circulating this money. I'm like, well, what about the people in the community who they're supposed to be serving who need the jobs? And so that's why I still stand by that white people doing work in the black community should really be trying to work themselves out of a job and be trying to transfer that job to the people in the neighborhood that they're doing the work in. So anyway, Earthworks Urban Farm has done an excellent job in my mind of addressing this problem of coming into a community in a respectful way and trying to empower the community as opposed to coming in with the attitude that you know what's best for people and that you have the answer for folks, which is often the case. So the monthly discussions have continued undoing racism in the Detroit food system. This past year, the Kellogg Foundation looked at what we were doing and decided they wanted to fund us for $90,000. So we've been able to hire a coordinator who's not white. And in fact, a black woman who is president emeritus of the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development. So she was very close with Rosa Parks. And so she's currently our coordinator. And so we're able to now get a little more traction because we have somebody working on this work full time. So the monthly discussions continue. We did our second annual 2-day intensive training this year. But one of the most important aspects of the work that we're doing, and one of the things I'm going to recommend that you consider doing here in Ithaca, is as part of the training, we have created study groups. And so we started with one, what we call the White Caucus. And then we had something, we weren't sure if we were going to call it the People of Color Caucus or the Black Caucus. So we had a meeting, the people of color had a meeting to decide. And lots of the black folks said, well, we don't want to just be people of color, we want to be black people. So, we said, okay, cool. And I was part of that group, by the way, let me say that, okay? So we have a People of Color Caucus, so those who want to identify as people of color can be in the People of Color Caucus. Those who want to identify as black can be in the Black Caucus. Then the white people, it started growing. And so they were reading a book called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Some of you might be familiar with it. And so they had kind of developed this collective consciousness because they had read this book together and discussed it together and, bounced around certain ideas. They had the benefit of the discussions that they had all participated in. So they didn't want new white people coming into their group because they hadn't gone through that. So they started another white caucus, right? So now we have 3 white caucuses because there's lots of white folks interested in this work, which is a good thing. Right? And so we have lots of young white people moving back into Detroit and lots of young white people moving into Detroit to do urban agriculture work too. A lot of them maybe went to the University of Michigan or something and think it's a cool idea. So lots of them are now coming in being influenced by this work. So now we have 3 white caucuses, 1 black caucus, and 1 people of color caucus. But these caucuses are important because this idea of transforming and really coming to grips with how white supremacy has impacted us is not an individual venture. Now, in the black community for a long time, there's been various efforts to help us divest ourselves of the internalized inferiority or the internalized oppression that is a characteristic of living in a white supremacist society. And so we've had all kind of efforts. You know, that's why in 1969, some students with some shotguns and things like that, you know, took over a building here at Cornell, and things like that happened all across the country because people were demanding black studies departments or Africana studies departments because they understood that there was a relationship between the study of the history of African and African American people and how we feel about ourselves. If you don't know much about yourself, you're probably not going to feel real good. If the only thing you know about yourself is that your great-grandfather picked cotton in Mississippi, you know, that's not really a heritage you want to really embrace. But then when you start learning about, well, there were civilizations, you know, prior to Africans being enslaved, and not only that, Africans were the mothers and fathers of humanity. And the very first human beings were Africans, and everybody else on the earth evolved from those Africans as they moved, and Africans created civilizations and created mathematics and science and music and geography and astronomy. When you start learning that, you begin to see yourself in a different light. And so for the past 40 years, to some extent, you know, black people have been involved in a process to divest ourselves of this internalized sense of inferiority. The problem is that there hasn't been a corresponding movement that I'm aware of on a large level. I mean, there's a few like radical hippie, ex-hippie types like him that are, you know, that are grappling with this issue. But among the masses of white people, there's no movement to grapple with how white supremacy has impacted them. And so these caucuses are important because it's through a group process that we help to transform. There's a church in Detroit called the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And they believe in a theology they call black Christian nationalism. And so one of the things they specialize in is helping black people to transform and to throw off what they call the Declaration of Black Inferiority. And so they have these groups, and within the groups, you know, people confront each other and they confront their fears. And so it's through the group process that people are able to grow and transform. So I'm suggesting to you, to those of you who identify as white, and for those of you who identify as either black or person of color also, that this process of working through how white supremacy has impacted us is best done in a collective. And so that might be a study group, it might be a discussion group. You can't do it by yourself, okay? In fact, no significant social change is made by individuals. You know, I mean, there's a role for the individual in terms of your personal transformation, but even, you know, we're social beings, so none of us transforms ourselves individually. We do it by talking with other people, by interacting with other people. So I really strongly want to suggest that for those who are interested in addressing racism within the food system, which frankly is no different than addressing racism in the larger society. You know, the food system is just one way in which white supremacy manifests. It manifests in every institution in society, including this your beloved Cornell here, I'm sure, okay? There's no major institution in American society which is exempt from this phenomenon we call white supremacy. So really, by studying how it manifests, I mean, you kind of give yourself a heads up on how the whole society is affected by it. But specifically, since many of us are food activists, we want to be aware of how race plays a role within the food system. So again, I just want to encourage you to do that in groups and collectives. And there's a number of books out. Some of you have probably heard about Tim Wise, who goes across the country doing lectures. Some people like him, some people don't. You know, I think he's got a lot of valuable things to say. And, you know, typically I don't agree 100% with anybody. And so, you know, with anybody, even, you know, with me, you're going to glean what you think is important from it, and the rest of it you chuck off to the side somewhere. So the same with Tim Wise and other people. But there's a number of writers now who are addressing this and are addressing it in a way which is designed to be accessible to people who identify themselves as white. So I think that's very important. I think it's important that black people and other people of color engage in a group process to divest ourselves of this internalized sense of inferiority. So that's probably the most important thing I want to leave with you, that this is a group process, and if you're serious about it, you need to band together, even if it's 3, 4, 5 people, to start some kind of monthly discussion or bi-weekly discussion. And then you have to take it from the discussion stage to the action stage. Because I've seen study groups. In fact, I'm not really a big study group fan, because I've seen study groups within the community that I'm a part of, the African Centered Study Group, who do a lot of study of ancient African civilizations, but they've been studying that for 15 years. It's like, well, I mean, that's good to know all that. I'm glad they know it. I know people who climbed up to the top of the Great Pyramid and put a red, black, and green flag on the top and all that. I mean, that's all good, but now, what are you going to do? So I'm of the mindset that knowledge is only important to the extent that you can use it to transform your reality. Just to have a bunch of stuff in your head and say, I read more books than you read, and I got more letters behind my name than you do. It's like, so what? If you can't use it to actually transform our reality. So my study of ancient African history suggested that all of these higher, esoteric mysteries that people were able to unravel, they were able to take that knowledge to actually transform their society. And so I would suggest to you that once you begin studying, then the next level is activism, to actually be involved in transforming the society. I draw a lot of inspiration from the African liberation struggles that took place on the continent of Africa in the 1960s and 70s. And some of you might remember African Liberation Day, the African Liberation Support Committee. And this is at a time when Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola was still colonized by the Portuguese. They were the last just straight up colonies in Africa. We still had South Africa, which was kind of what we call a settler colony. But while the Portuguese still had their hands in the early 70s on these three African nations, there was this big movement. And so I draw a lot of inspiration from that movement. So one of my heroes, or one of the people I looked to for inspiration, was the first president of Mozambique, whose name was Samora Machel. Samora Machel was died mysteriously in a plane accident, and it's widely believed that the South African secret police were behind that. But Samora Machel said, "Struggle is the best university," and so I adhere to that. I can tell you, although I've been in many college courses, and I've listened to many lectures and I've read many books, that the most rewarding growth that I have had has been by actively being engaged in my community and transforming that community. Because, let me back up and say, another person who I draw great inspiration from is Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of independent Ghana. And Kwame Nkrumah said that theory without action is void, and action without theory is blind. And so we need both theory and action, or theory and practice. And so it's the interplay between those things that really moves us forward in our movement. So we have ideas about how we transform society. And then after you kind of firm up your ideas, then you go out and you try to implement those ideas. And it's through the implementation that you begin to see, well, maybe this doesn't work so well. Because a lot of times, activists, we're like real idealistic, right? We got all these, ideas about how we're going to create utopia. And then we get out in the community, we find out it doesn't work so smoothly. Right, Eco Village? I mean, and I'm not picking on them because I love what they're doing. But that's with any movement. You get out and you find, well, maybe our ideas need to be altered a little bit. So then you go back and you revise your theory. Then you go back and you try it again. You practice it. Then you go back and you revise. So that's an ongoing process. So I'm suggesting to you, one, that you engage yourself in study groups. Two, that the study groups then have an activist slant, that you actually pick something that you're going to do. And three, then you look at your action and you study it and you revise your theory and you continue to grow like that. So I think with that, I'll kind of end it and just open up the floor because I'm much more interested in discussion and interaction. So I will stop at that and just open the floor for discussion. Either way, it doesn't matter. I can do it. Okay. Questions or comments? Yes, in the back.
Thank you, and thank you for speaking and coming. I'm curious what one of the study circles, what's an example of one of the actions that they chose to focus on after they formed this caucuses?
Okay. There's a rich guy in Detroit named John Hance. And Mr. Hance is very wealthy. He says that he has $30 million that he wants to put towards creating the world's largest urban farm. And his project has no kind of social justice aspect. It has no community empowerment aspect. And in fact, in Forbes magazine about a year and a half ago, he said really what he's trying to do is to make the land more scarce so that he can drive up the value of the land. And so there's lots of people in the grassroots urban ag movement who are opposed to what he's doing. So some of these white allies, he was doing a panel. In fact, let me give you a little more context. The University of Michigan, which is like a real prestigious school like Cornell, right? They do lots of experiments for the government too and devise all kind of dastardly things. Decided they wanted to have a series on urban agriculture because this thing is really blowing up so much. So, you know, the academics started running behind the activists trying to figure out how do we catch up with, you know, with what they're doing. So they had two public forums. The first one, they invited me to be on a panel, and they invited some of the other folks who are members of the most active organization doing urban ag work in Detroit. We had a lot of discussion. People in the audience were able to, you know, just like this, ask questions, and it was free dialogue. The next month, they had part 2 of this. And so they had John Hance as part of the panel. So some of these white allies decided they would go bum rush the show, right? Y'all know about that? Public Enemy? They don't know what I'm talking. Y'all know about Public Enemy? No, most people don't. Okay. Huh? Well, anyway, Public Enemy is a hip-hop group. They had an album in the 90s called Bum Rush the Show. So some of these white allies decided they will bum rush the show. And so they did that. So that was one of the actions, you know, so they stood up and they created a kind of uncomfortable situation. But, you know, the system is very smart and they figure out how to manage resistance and what have you. And so what they did at the second forum, instead of having where you could just stand up and ask your question, you had to write your question down on a card. Then the cards were handed to somebody who filtered them. You got cards too? And then a second person filtered them. So by the time they got up to the panelists, you know, it was like all, you know, milk toast or whatever. So, but that's one example of an action that was taken by some of the white allies. And, you know, frankly, there's some things in this struggle that white people can do more effectively than people of color. And so, you know, we have to be strategic. And, you know, some things black folks need to do on their own. Some things we need multicultural coalitions to do. Some things a white person in a suit and tie needs to go in and, you know, front. You know, there's all kind of strategies in this movement. So that's one example of that. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Do the white caucuses check in with the people of color before they go bum rush the stage, or you know, take action on behalf of anti-racism?
Yes. Yeah, there's constant dialogue. I'm sorry. The question was, do the white caucuses check in with the people of color before they bum rush the show? And so at our monthly meetings, there's kind of a check-in from all the caucuses. And so we have this dialogue. So the purpose of this is not to separate people. It's not to separate, and you know, some people when they first saw this, the white caucus and the black caucus, they're like, y'all are racist and you trying to resegregate people. That's not the purpose of it. The idea is that people with similar experiences can talk to each other and perhaps grow in a more advantageous manner. But then there's also times when it's important for white folks and black folks to get together and have some dialogue. I can tell you myself, I've grown tremendously as a result of being involved in this urban ag movement and having discussion and dialogue with white people. Because I told you before, a few years ago, it's like I didn't talk to a lot of white people, frankly. I ran an African-centered school, so I was immersed in Africanity, right? And so, you know, so I've grown as a result of it, and I can assure you the white people who have come in contact with us have grown. Sometimes not willingly, sometimes they've been stretched, but yes, ma'am.
You actually following up on that, the one question that I've been thinking about, you mentioned that you learned how to speak to white crowds, and
somewhat.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear like what you've experienced viscerally are some of those differences, and when you talk about conversations where you learned how to bring white and blacks and people of color together, like what have you learned and what things would you share about building those types of conversations in a healthy way?
Well, the difference, one of the question was, it was a multifaceted question. I think the first part of the question was,
The experiences that you've had, you said you learned how to...
Oh, yeah. Learning how, what are the differences in white audiences and black audiences, what have I learned that I've experienced? That was one question. The second part of the question, I have short-term memory loss.
The second part is more of like sharing with us, as after you leave and we engage in conversations.
Yes.
You say you've learned a lot in these caucuses,
Yes.
interacting with.
Yes.
And what would you leave us with advice of how
Okay.
to, in a healthy way, dialogue?
Okay, thank you. So how, in a healthy, what advice do I have in terms of how do we have this healthy dialogue? So maybe let me start with that part. And really, you know, I just left a lecture by Lily Ye and the Center for Transformative Change. Is that what it's called? Action. They had a little short film at the beginning, and a couple points really stuck out with me. But one of the points that stuck out is recognizing, and I'm paraphrasing, but recognizing kind of the humanity of people who even you consider to be maybe your enemy or to not have the same viewpoint as you. And so I think that's something that I have learned, that I realize now that in a way, white people are victimized by white supremacy also. It's not that white people are intentionally trying to be racist for the most part. And so I guess I can identify more with the struggle of white people who are trying to kind of undo this legacy that they are unwittingly a part of. And I can recognize the humanity in them and them trying to kind of go through that struggle. So that's been transformative for me. When you can look in somebody's eyes and really see, this is another human being. They're faced with a particular set of circumstances that they're trying to figure out how to work through the best they can, given what they know and who they are. And we're trying to do the same thing. So on that level, it's kind of an equalizer. So that's one of the things I've learned. Differences in white audiences and black audiences. Black people have this tradition we call call and response. And so when you talk to black people, you got people in the back shouting stuff and, or, if they disagree with you even, you got people heckling you in the back of the room. And, black folks are just very animated and like, it's not like a lecture in an audience. It's like, the people in the audience are part of the lecture too. So, and really I like that, I like that kind of interaction. Even if people disagree, I like that dynamic. And a lot of times white audiences, when I talk to white people, they're like looking at me. And so, so I don't know if that means that when I get through talking, they're going to try to jump on me or what, because they just like looking straight faced and, then sometimes after that they come up and say, oh, I really appreciate what you were saying. I was like, I thought you were going to cut me or something, But, so, I mean, that's one of the differences in white audiences. But, one of the things I've learned, see, the reason I tell jokes a lot is because jokes kind of cause people to relax, right? And so that's one of the things I've learned, because as a person who considered myself a black revolutionary, back in the day, black revolutionary people, we didn't smile much, and, you had to wear dark glasses and, look real mean all the time, right? And so, that kind of thing, that makes people afraid. And so I've learned that if you keep it kind of light and, you interject humor, that it causes people to relax and then people can hear what you're saying. So those are some of the lessons that I've learned. But, I think the reality, the bigger reality is this, that we are all human beings on planet Earth, and Earth is in a crisis. And so we're going to have to find a way to work this thing out. And we all have something to learn from each other. So that's the other thing that I've learned, that no matter what situation I'm in, I don't care whose presence I'm put in or who's put my presence, it's all for a special reason. There's something I have to learn from everybody who enters into my sphere. I don't care whether they identify themselves as white, black, Latino, Asian. It doesn't matter. None of that happens by accident. None of it's random. And so I try to really humble myself and learn from everybody whose presence I come into. And so that's been a growth process for me as well. Okay, yes.
I just want to thank you again for just everything that's been Like that, you know, you're not a celebrity, but I'd follow you anywhere to hear you talk.
Please don't follow me.
It's been a pleasure.
Let me just tell you this. If you follow me, you might get stopped by the police.
I know. That's going to happen anyway. But what I like, I've got a lot out of everything. You know, I came to Ithaca from Harlem. It was a culture shock. I grew up in that era with you, where we had the Muslims on 116th Street, Black Panthers on 123rd. Yes, yes, and so it was a really good time to go up, and you learned, you know, you became proud of who you were. I moved to Ithaca and I seen something different. However, when I came to Ithaca, I come from a large black community, and that's all I seen for days, and unless it was a teacher or a doctor or something. But when I got here, my mindset, so I've been educated. My mindset when I came here, I thought all white people were rich. Until I wound up in a shelter and there was one white woman in there with me. And that helped me, and we became very good friends. And I learned to be able to like look at people for people. Like I don't try not to be realistic about it, like some of the things that we need to do. And I believe this food thing has become really big. It's a lot of grants. There's a lot of grants out there, so a lot of people are interested not only in the food safety, but also the food grant. What I'm concerned about is the part that you talk about is like coming in and saving us once again, and then pulling out, and we're left with nothing once again. And that's real important for me. The education of one another, and I believe like white people are our ally. There are a lot of them that like us.
Not all of them.
I know that I do know, and I'm real clear about that.
Don't get it twisted.
I'm not. But I do ask them to step up. You know, it's not just the food thing. There's a lot of things that go on that we need our allies to take care of, if they are truly our allies. You know, there are a host of things that happen in Ithaca that, like, I'm meetinged out. The meeting we had tonight, I've seen 18 years of meetings like this. And my concern is, what do we do once you go back to Detroit? We go back to our safety little spots and continue to talk about what we need to do, should do, what we're gonna do. And you know, I'm gonna get off the soapbox, but I do wanna see what comes out of this. Because I stopped going to meetings. I'm tired of listening to the something, and nothing happened. And I really have, so this is like lit a fire under me with you coming here, and I want to get more involved.
Okay, well, let me say this. This thing about white supremacy, it's not just about bashing white people and telling white people they need to study and transform. That's part of it. I mean, not bashing them, but, you know, the transform. But the other part of it is that black people got to step up. I mean, just straight up. You know, and probably 20 years ago, I wouldn't have said that in a mixed audience. You know, that would have been like a little family thing. We go behind the door and talk to other black. But I'm just going to say it straight up. Black people need to step up, okay? Because, see, sometimes just by default, white people end up being in charge of stuff because we're not at the table. You know, not because somebody has said you don't have a seat at the, we didn't step up. And so part of that is a result of our internalization of this sense of inferiority and our sense of disempowerment. And so that's what I would suggest to you and the other black people here today, the people who were at the thing I spoke at this afternoon, step up and make it happen. You know, we have the capacity to make it happen. It doesn't take 50 people to make it happen. If it's 3, step up and make it happen. Simple as that. You know, like we tell some of the young brothers in Detroit, man up. Or woman up or whatever. Woman up. Yesterday also I had a chance to talk to Dr. James Turner. Jamila took me over. We went to the Africana Studies. Is it a program or department or what is it now? I don't know. I know it's being diluted or something. But what it should be. Center, whatever it's called, this building where the Africana Studies program is housed also has a library. And I almost had to be pulled out of there because there was just so much information. And I'm firmly convinced that for white people who are sincere about their own transformation, that in large part, that transformation is going to come by humbling yourself and studying the history and the experiences of the people who are most marginalized. Because it's the people who've been grappling with this thing. We've been grappling with white supremacy for a long time, right? And so there's all kind of, you know, revelations that we've had about it or strategies that we've developed. And so that's one of the the reasons that white supremacy deprives white people too. Because if you only study your own history and culture, you only know about the Greeks and the Romans and, then you're not able to absorb the rich cultural experiences of other people too. So there's been this tremendous history of struggle in this country, and people know, just the surface of it. And I'm speaking of the history of struggle by those people we call African Americans. And, I've studied it for like 40 years, and I only know, the surface. So it's a lifetime's study. So I'll probably have to reincarnate several times before I have a more full understanding of it. But I would highly recommend that too, that, you begin to study, black struggle and the struggle of the Chicano people, the struggle of the Puerto Rican nationalists, the struggle of the so-called American Indian movement. There's a lot to glean from those experiences, which makes all of us richer and more full and more well-equipped to deal with these problems we're faced with. Somebody else, let me get her first. I might have mentioned on Saturday, I'm a reforming chauvinist, so I always announce that. And because also in fact, there's a lot of information out. My friend Raj Patel writes a lot about how women are really within the food system are the ones most adversely impacted by food insecurity. And so we can't talk about food justice without talking about gender. And so that's why I'm picking her first instead of you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, because I kind of wanted, you remember you and I sat at one of the food securities, and I heard your story. And then, you heard a little bit back from me about how one of the things I'm interested in is sort of demography and where people of different color live within sort of a larger region. Because in fact, we are pretty much in a rural farming area here, and most of the people of color live in that other 8 million people down where you came from. And, my daughter used to live down there and work for a group called Hunger Action Network, and there's a lot of really hungry people, and there's not all that spare land that you guys have in Detroit, not at all. So, I'm really interested in what you think we can do in terms of regional networking. I mean, I'm working with farmers now who are growing grains and beans up here and then bringing them down into New York City and selling them at green markets and selling them at food co-ops. Some of those are the crops that it's hard to make go with urban agriculture, even if you've got land for it. So what role do you think there is for people who are from, predominantly white rural areas to work in concert with people from urban areas where they don't have so much land?
First, thank you very much for your question, because I'm from a city, I mostly talk about urban agriculture. But the reality is urban agriculture is not going to replace rural agriculture. Okay, it's not. We're not going to have fields of wheat growing in Detroit. And
Definitely not broken.
And we probably won't have herds of cattle in Detroit either. Although there's somebody who has proposed, one white guy who is a farmer who went out of business, emailed me a couple months ago, said he wants to bring his cow down to Detroit and just put it in lots and move it from lot to lot. I guess he's trying to make a statement about it. But I think it's extremely important that we find a way to have a dialogue between people who are involved in urban agriculture, in urban food justice, with rural farmers. Now, that might be a difficult dialogue because those groups traditionally haven't talked to each other. But we have to find a way to make that happen. And you're absolutely right. There's this great abundance here. And then New York City is what, 200 miles away? 250?
You can drive down to Market and back. People do it from here.
Okay. So, I mean, somehow I agree. We have to bridge that gap. And so it's going to take some difficult conversations that haven't been held before. In fact, really, to survive this coming crisis on the earth is going to require some difficult conversations that we haven't had before. But the other thing is it's in the mutual interest of both groups to have this discussion. You got people growing food, you got people who need food, who can buy it, and so it seems there would be a natural linkage. And so that might be some of the things, I never come to a place and tell people what they should do. Because I don't know. I'm not, you're here. I can tell you about Detroit. So, but that might be one of the things that people here can begin to facilitate. I know there's a gentleman, Dennis Derrick. I don't know if anyone knows of him, but he's an economics professor at the New School. And he has a co-op that he started in Harlem where he's getting food from upstate New York, from farmers in this area, and bringing it for this share program that he has in New York City. And so he's beginning some of that. We need much more of that. In Michigan, we need the same thing. In Michigan, I might have mentioned on Saturday, there's this law called the Right to Farm Act, which is a statewide act, which really is handcuffing the city of Detroit from making ordinances that regulate urban ag within the city. And so there needs to be, and so when the people in the city of Detroit went to the state and said, we want a waiver from this, the Farm Bureau opposed it. So we need to have some discussion between traditional farmers and even those who, as much as I hate it, those who are using, who are the big ag people and the, who are, or at least who are affiliated with them, right? We need to have discussion with them too. We can't afford to isolate ourselves in silos and not have these discussions. So those folks need to be talking to folks that are talking about sustainable agriculture and figuring out, where's the common ground? In fact, really, I think really for people on planet Earth to survive, we're going to have to figure out where's the common ground and how do we create that commons? How do we see what the mutual interest is? And so, I hope maybe some people in this room today will initiate some dialogue like that. Yes. Oh, we call on you. Yes.
I was once a hippie. I still am a hippie. Embrace the hippie. I think it's important because a lot of what you're talking about is a lot about what the hippies were talking about back in the 1960s. And I think it's important for people to recognize that in so many ways the hippies were right about a lot of stuff. A couple of the things you mentioned, one of them, you were talking about racism and how racism around food is really no different than racism in any other way. But one of the biggest things about food is it has a special ability to bring people together. Yes. So no matter what we're doing, if there's food involved, it's a much better chance to get people involved. And you talk about black people getting more involved and manning up and owning up and stuff. But in our community for the last 15 plus years, I've been trying to get the different groups that I've been involved in to go to places where other people are. So when there's meetings, we could have it in areas like for the Tompkins County Green Party. We could have it at Southside Community Center, which is a more traditionally black neighborhood and black area. And people are resistant to it. They want to do it in the same places, not because they're white, but it's because they're familiar with it. And they're comfortable. And it's so hard in so many ways to break that comfort level. And that's a constant struggle. I want people to recognize that whenever you're part of any group, if anyone mentions that or if you're comfortable mentioning it, that's a good way to start things and make change happen.
I agree with everything my hippie friend said. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to comment first on what the woman who I can't see about the rural. I also around here there are a lot of rural people who are really low income. I just wanted to comment and then ask a question, but there's a lot of rural people who are also low income. So as far as the woman's question who said that over there, maybe there's also ways that we can also be working in rural communities if that's where you live and are growing food, because there's that dichotomy of the Iowa farmer is the most hungry, that they're growing all this food. So sometimes that might be an answer to your question. But my question's about role, and you were saying that if we're in an organization, maybe in a white person, maybe we work ourselves out of our job. And I totally agree with that. And I think in Ithaca we struggle a lot with role. And I haven't been here that long, almost 2 years, and work with a lot of the wonderful people in the room working on food security, and always struggle with role. And I think both black people struggle with it and white people struggle with it. And I think in our organization with Gardens for Humanity, we're often letting the people of color try to reach the people of color, and because then the white people don't have the connection with the black people who we're trying to reach. And it's always this constant, I feel like the weight on the people of color to get more people of color involved is so huge, and I always wonder, what do I do as that white person? And so it's this constant, it's a huge challenge. And I think in Ithaca, in the work here, I feel like it's always a struggle with our group, that we really don't know how to help each other do our work better to reach the people we all want to reach, whatever color, whatever income. And so whatever expertise you can provide for us, I think that could help us make that action steps.
We got somebody else I think wants to respond. So.
Thank you. I just want to, first of all, thank you for being here and coexisting and performing your humanity. I like to say that your Booker T. Washington quote, where there's no struggle, there's no progress.
That's what I was thinking. Exactly.
That's it. We can talk later if you want to have mutual respect with
that's similar to what I was going to say. You know, I'm not coming to you with answers. In fact, I have many more questions than I have answers. So, but what's important is that we're engaged in this process. We're engaged in this struggle. I interviewed several people at Eco Village yesterday, and what several of them said is this is imperfect, right? But it's the process. It's the process. You know, you learn, you're growing, you know. And so that, you know, that's all you can ask. You know, that people are sincere and they work on it and that they study their mistakes and they try to make improvements. And so I don't really have an answer for your question except just to say stay engaged. Stay engaged in the struggle, and then answers will begin to emerge, or what appears to be answers will emerge. And if they're not really answers, you'll know that in time too.
I think also that we had a conversation the other day about a young woman who was thinking about moving back. She had gone to university missionaries, thinking about moving back to Yakini, and so the question came up, so what happens if I want to do something and, you know, I want so bad, or I see something that needs to be done, how can I do that? You know, when he was trying to tell a young lady, you know, make sure that you always allow the community, because that is their community, to have the first, you know, do. So how about you, his suggestion was, how about you ask someone in the community, because perhaps they had the same questions, that maybe they had the same idea that you did, but you just don't understand it, or you didn't know that because you never asked them, and they don't have connection to the same resources. So a lot of times I work with people who seem to think that they have all the answers and they want to go ahead and do it, and they think that we're going too slow, or black people are going too slow, and so I just want to make that happen. But in actuality, empowering a community, or helping to empower a community, right, has to do with allowing them to do that on their own, giving cause to what their issues are, understanding what their needs are, and then assisting them in that. It doesn't mean that you have to take you don't have to take the reins and go ahead and do it because you can do it faster, because you think you can do it more efficient, or because you have the resources, but maybe pass those resources on so that community can make that opportunity happen for themselves. So I think a lot of times that is what I see in the relationships that we have around here, is that, you know, everyone has these great ideas, so they want to make them happen all super fast without actual engagement of the community, or without actual involvement of the community, because they think they can do it better, or they think that they can do it faster, or because it is, you know, because they are a little bit faster, right? Because they have more means during the course of the day, where the majority of us are working 3 jobs a day or something like that. So you have to understand that there are things that are going on in the black communities or communities of color that you may not be understanding of. So you have to take time to be a part of those communities to understand those things in order for us to move together forward.
Yeah, what she said. Yes, and I think you had your hand up in the back also. Okay, 1, then 2. Oh, is that Jason? Yeah. Hey, what's happening? You all right? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I was trying to pass the question to her.
Oh, okay.
I just have a question about, you mentioned people, a lot of like white young people moving into the city to kind of start these movements. And I mean, I've looked at the history of Detroit a bit. I'm from Atlanta, and people are worried about similar issues as this like kind of re-urbanization movement, and like the opposite of what went on in the 50s, right? And in the 50s, 40s, 30s, there were federal laws like around in neighborhoods outside of Detroit, and then homeowners associations that like set these legal terms to limit people of color, mostly black people, from moving up north, right? So I'm wondering if the community you're working in Detroit has started working on any sorts of your own sorts of like rights and keeping property values low, because I mean, regardless of intention and desires of people maybe moving back in, there's still going to be that sort of market outcome and like possibility for property values to go up and pushing people out, right? So I'm wondering if you see any of that, or if that's not even the case in Detroit.
First of all, can everybody hear her question? That was a really long question. I want to try to summarize what I think I heard. First, she gave some history and talked about how there was really legal discrimination that created segregation, and homeowners associations that had pacts that assured that houses would only be sold to white people and that black people couldn't move into certain neighborhoods. So there was that kind of legal segregation. And she talked about now we have this reurbanization movement. We have young white people moving into cities. And I think her question was, is there anything going on right now in Detroit to assert the property rights of the people who are living in the city? My answer is I'm not sure. There's a lot of different things happening. And really, I'm so engrossed in this food movement that I don't have everything on my radar. There's a lot of things going on. It may be I'm not aware of it. One of the things that's happening in Detroit right now is we have serious regentrification happening. We have lots of, in fact, in the last couple of years, about 15,000 young white people have moved in Detroit. And in fact, the city government is offering incentives to certain companies, which are predominantly white companies, to have their employees move into the city. So there are certain neighborhoods which have kind of been identified as the model neighborhoods for this, what they're calling redevelopment. And so in one of those neighborhoods, Whole Foods announced a few months ago that they're going to move in. And so, you know, many of you have heard the term whole paycheck. And frankly, I'm not a totally anti-Whole Foods person. In fact, once in a while, I've gone in there myself, right? But it's context is everything. So it's not just the Whole Foods is moving into Detroit. It's that they're doing it in the context of this influx of young whites into this particular area of the city. And so this is further cementing the regentrification. So what the Detroit Food Policy Council is doing, and it doesn't answer your question directly, but it's kind of a similar effort. What we're doing is we have gotten Whole Foods to agree to engage in a discussion with community members about putting together a community benefits agreement. And some of you might be familiar with that concept, so that we look at how, in one sense, the least harm can be done and how perhaps the greater good can be done. How can we make this a situation that benefits the majority of the people in the city of Detroit and in the community that this store is moving into? Now, one of the dynamics, for example, is Whole Foods is a very large national chain. And so often, you know, although Whole Foods has some things that are very pricey, they also have some things that are comparable to what you might find in a regular supermarket. And so we have some smaller black-owned produce stores in that same area. And so our concern is that the same thing might happen to those smaller stores that happens to a mom-and-pop hardware store when Home Depot moves down the block. And so they have agreed to engage in this community benefits agreement dialogue. We'll see what comes out of it. But I would advocate that in other areas of development that community members also challenge the city's plan for development and begin to look at how we can reshape those plans in a way that benefits the majority of the population. I probably didn't answer your question at all, but okay, one more question, Jason.
Okay, a quick comment and then a quick question. I just want to say, you know, we've been bringing youth from Ithaca for the last 2 summers to Detroit and working with some of Malik's colleagues. This summer we had an amazing event, Farm to Fork dinner, where teenagers came and harvested from community gardens, prepared a meal with a professional chef, served it. You know, some of you know us, and you know we've got this solar-powered bus, and we powered up the DJ sound system, and we had a little party, and it was really awesome. So the stuff going on in Detroit is really inspiring, and it's good that we have this connection. It's good to have you out here. My question is that, you know, I've been hearing from some quarters that with all this money that's coming in and all this attention to urban agriculture, that there's a danger of both increased gentrification being facilitated, and then also some people are articulating it as a new form of 21st century sharecropping. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Let me deal with the second part of your question first. Part of the work of our organization, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, is to reframe agriculture work for Detroit's majority African American population as an act of self-determination. Because the frame that we have predominantly is that of sharecropping, tenant farming, and slavery. And so many black people, when you say something about putting a tomato plant in the ground, they don't want no parts of that. Because the only thing they can think about is some white man, you know, making them do it and getting money off of them. So we're reframing this as an act of community self-determination. And so that's a process. So that's part of what we're doing. Foundations are throwing a lot of money into Detroit right now. And some of that is good, and some of it is not so good, because we have some foundations that are manipulating the process and kind of exerting their will through throwing money around. So all money is not good money, right? So one of the things that people in the urban ag movement are starting to do is to talk about principles of partnership and under what terms do we want foundations to bring money, and who controls that, and how do we avoid being manipulated. So there's a lot of that discussion taking place in Detroit. And there's also this project I mentioned, the Hans Project, and one of the things people fear about it is that it reinforces that paradigm of a wealthy white man who may hire some people from the community to work on his project. We don't know what's going to really happen with that. But also, on the Hans Farm Project, what is not often publicized is that 90% of what he's talking about doing is growing Christmas trees. Only 10% of it is actually food production. Okay, I think we are at the end. And Jason, thank you very much for coming. I don't know if you all know Jason and Leslie, but they're living off the grid, and they have a wonderful weekly phone call that several people in Detroit participate in, and they're linking up with our friends at the Black Oak Center for Sustainable and Renewable Living in Pembroke, Illinois. So they're doing wonderful work. I'm very glad that you were able to make it today. I want to thank everybody who came. I want to thank everybody who had a kind word to say to me today, or provided a place for me to sleep, or provided warm tempeh for me to eat in the morning. All of those who have been brave enough, courageous enough. And the reality, what I found is it takes courage, especially on the part of white people, to engage this issue. So to those people who identify themselves as white, who are courageous enough to begin to grapple with this, I want to encourage you. To those who are people of color, or specifically African people, I want to encourage you to continue to exhibit self-determination, to empower yourself. You don't have to ask for permission from anybody. Step up and do what has to be done in your community. Be fair, be just, be an example of what it means to be a human being. And as I started out, when I started out, I think there's some wonderful things going on in Ithaca. You're not starting from ground zero. You have a wonderful foundation to build on. It needs to be tweaked a little bit, and if you're sincere, you'll figure out how to do that. But you got a lot of good things going on here, and really realize the goodness that's surrounding you, and let it shine as an example for the rest of humanity. So thank you very much. Thank you.